This is chapter 13. The next morning we were up and dressed at 10 o'clock. We went to the commissaire of the hotel. I don't know what a commissaire is, but that is the man we went to, and told him we wanted a guide. He said the National Exposition had drawn such multitudes of Englishmen and Americans to Paris that it would be next to impossible to find a good guide unemployed. He said he usually kept a dozen or two on hand, but he only had 3 now. He called them. One looked so like a very pirate that we let him go at once. The next one spoke with a simpering precision of pronunciation that was irritating, and said, "If ze gentleman will to me make ze grand honneur to me retain in his service, I shall show him everything that is magnifique to look upon in ze beautiful Paris. I speaky ze English parfaitement." He would have done well to have stopped there, because he had that much by heart, and said it right off without making a mistake. But his self-complacency seduced him into attempting a flight into regions of unexplored English, and the reckless experiment was his ruin. Within 10 seconds he was so tangled up in a maze of mutilated verbs and torn and bleeding forms of speech that no human ingenuity could ever have gotten him out of it with credit. It was plain enough that he could not speaky the English quite as parfaitement as he pretended he could. The third man captured us. He was plainly dressed, but he had a noticeable air of neatness about him. He wore a high silk hat, which was a little old, but had been carefully brushed. He wore second-hand kid gloves in good repair, and carried a small rattan cane with a curved handle, a female leg of ivory. He stepped as gently and as daintily as a cat crossing a muddy street, and oh, he was urbanity. He was quiet, unobtrusive self-possession. He was deference itself. He spoke softly and guardedly, and when he was about to make a statement on his sole responsibility or offer a suggestion, he weighed it by drachms and scruples first. With the crook of his little stick placed meditatively to his teeth. His opening speech was perfect. It was perfect in construction, in phraseology, in grammar, in emphasis, in pronunciation, everything. He spoke little and guardedly after that. We were charmed. We were more than charmed. We were overjoyed. We hired him at once. We never even asked him his price. This man, our lackey, our servant, our unquestioning slave though he was still a gentleman. We could see that. While the other two, one was coarse and awkward, and the other was a born pirate. We asked our man Friday's name. He drew from his pocketbook a snowy little card and passed it to us with a profound bow. A. Billfinger, Guide to Paris, France, Germany, Spain, etc., etc., Grand Hotel du Louvre. Billfinger, oh, carry me home to die. That was an aside from Dan. The atrocious name grated harshly on my ear, too. That most of us can learn to forgive and even to like a countenance that strikes us unpleasantly at first, but few of us, I fancy, become reconciled to a jarring name so easily. I was almost sorry we had hired this man, his name was so unbearable. However, no matter. We were impatient to start. Billfinger stepped to the door to call a carriage, and then the doctor said, "Well, the guide goes with the barber shop, with the billiard table, with the gasless room, and maybe with many other pretty romance of Paris. I expected to have a guide named Henry de Montmorency or Armand de la Chartreuse, or something that would sound grand in letters to the villagers at home. But to think of a Frenchman by the name of Billfinger! Oh, this is absurd, you know. This will never do. We can't say Billfinger. It is nauseating. Name him over again. What had we better call him? Alexis du Coulincourt? Alphonse Henry Gustave de Hauteville, I suggested. Call him Ferguson, said Dan. That was a practical, unromantic good sense. Without debate, we expunged Billfinger as Billfinger and called him Ferguson. The carriage, an open barouche, was ready. Ferguson mounted beside the driver, and we whirled away to breakfast. As was proper, Mr. Ferguson stood by to transmit our orders and answer questions. By and by he mentioned casually the artful adventurer that he would go and get his breakfast as soon as we had finished ours. He knew we could not get along without him, and that we would not want to loiter about and wait for him. We asked him to sit down and eat with us. He begged with many a bow to be excused. It was not proper, he said. He would sit at another table. We ordered him peremptorily to sit down with us. Here endeth the first lesson. It was a mistake. As long as we had that fellow after that, he was always hungry. He was always thirsty. He came early and stayed late. He could not pass a restaurant. He looked with lecherous eye upon every wine shop. Suggestions to stop, excuses to eat and to drink were forever on his lips. We tried all we could to fill him so full that he would have no room to spare for a fortnight, but it was a failure. He did not hold enough to smother the cravings of his superhuman appetite. He had another discrepancy about him. He was always wanting us to buy things. On the shallowest pretenses, he would inveigle us into shirt stores, boot stores, tailor shops, glove shops, anywhere under the broad sweep of the heavens that there seemed a chance of our buying anything. Anyone could have guessed that the shopkeepers paid him a percentage on the sales, but in our blessed innocence, we didn't until this feature of his conduct grew unbearably prominent. One day Dan happened to mention that he thought of buying 3 or 4 silk dress patterns for presents. Ferguson's hungry eye was upon him in an instant. In the course of 20 minutes the carriage stopped. "What's this?" "This is the finest silk magazine in Paris, the most celebrate." "What did you come here for? We told you to take us to the Palace of the Louvre." "I suppose the gentleman say he wished to buy some silk." "You are not required to suppose things for the party, Ferguson. We do not wish to tax your energies too much. We will bear some of the burden and heat of the day ourselves. We will endeavor to do such supposing as is really necessary to be done. Drive on." So spake the doctor. Within 15 minutes the carriage halted again before another silk store. The doctor said, "Ah, the Palace of the Louvre. Beautiful, beautiful edifice. Does the Emperor Napoleon live here now, Ferguson?" "Ah, doctor, you do jest. This is not the palace. We come here directly, but since we passed right by this store where is such beautiful silk." "Ah, I see, I see. I meant to have told you that we do not wish to purchase any silks today, but in my absent-mindedness I forgot it. I also meant to tell you we wish to go directly to the Louvre, but I forgot that also. However, we will go there now. Pardon my seeming carelessness, Ferguson. Drive on." Within the half hour we stopped again in front of another silk store. We were angry, but the doctor, always serene, always smooth-voiced, he said, "At last, how imposing the Louvre is, and yet how small, how exquisitely fashioned, how charmingly situated. Venerable, venerable pile, Pardon, doctors, this is not the Louvre, it is— What is it? I have the idea. It come to me in a moment that the silk in this magazine— That we did not wish to buy any silks today, and I also intended to tell you that we yearned to go immediately to the palace of the Louvre, but enjoying the happiness of seeing you devour 4 breakfasts this morning has so filled me with pleasurable emotions that I neglect the commonest interests of the time. However, we will proceed now to the Louvre, Ferguson. But, doctor, excitedly, it will not take a minute, not but one small minute. The gentleman need not buy if he not wish to, but only look at the silk, look at the beautiful fabric. Then pleadingly, Sir, only one little moment. Dan said, Confound the idiot, I don't want to see any silks today. I won't look at them. Drive on. And the doctor, We need no silks, Ferguson. Our hearts yearn for the Louvre. Let us journey on. Let us journey on. But, doctor, it is only one moment, one little moment, and the time will be saved, entirely saved, because there is nothing to see now. It is too late. It want 10 minutes to 4, and the Louvre close at 4. Only one little moment, doctor. The treacherous miscreant, after 4 breakfasts and a gallon of champagne, to serve us such a scurvy trick. We got no sight of the countless treasures of art in the Louvre galleries that day, and our only poor little satisfaction was in the reflection that Ferguson sold not a solitary silk dress pattern. I am writing this chapter partly for the satisfaction of abusing that accomplished knave Billfinger, and partly to show whosoever shall read this how Americans fare at the hands of the Paris guides, and what sort of people the Paris guides are. It need not be supposed that we were a stupider or easier prey than our countrymen generally are, for we were not. The guides deceive and defraud every American who goes to Paris for the first time and sees its sights alone, or in company with others as little experienced as himself. I shall visit Paris again some day, and then let the guides beware. I shall go in my war paint. I shall carry my tomahawk along. I think we have lost but little time in Paris. We have gone to bed every night tired out. Of course, we visited the renowned International Exposition. All the world did that. We went there on our 3rd day in Paris, and we stayed there nearly 2 hours. It was our first and last visit. To tell the truth, we saw at a glance that one would have had to spend weeks, yea, months, in that monstrous establishment to get an intelligible idea of it. It was a wonderful show, but the moving masses of people of all nations we saw there were a still more wonderful show. I discovered that if I were there to stay there a month, I should still find myself looking at the people instead of the inanimate objects on exhibition. I got a little interested in some curious old tapestries of the 13th century, but a party of Arabs came by, and their dusky faces and quaint costumes called my attention away at once. I watched a silver swan which had a living grace about its movements and a living intelligence in his eyes, watched him swimming about as comfortably and unconcernedly as if he had been born in a morass instead of a jeweler's shop, watched him seize a silver fish from under the water and hold up his head and go through all the customary and elaborate motions of swallowing it. But the moment it disappeared down his throat, some tattooed South Sea Islanders approached, and I yielded to their attractions. Presently I found a revolving pistol several hundred years old, which looked strangely like a modern Colt, but just then I heard that the Empress of the French was in another part of the building, and hastened to see what she might look like. We heard martial music. We saw an unusual number of soldiers walking hurriedly about. There was a general movement among the people. We inquired what it was all about, and learned that the Emperor of the French and the Sultan of Turkey were about to review 25,000 troops at the Arc de Etoile. We immediately departed, and I had a greater anxiety to see these men than I could have had to see 20 expositions. We drove away and took up a position in open space opposite the American minister's house. A speculator bridged a couple of barrels with a board, and we hired standing places on it. Presently there was a sound of distant music. In another minute a pillar of dust came moving slowly toward us. A moment more, and then, with colors flying and a grand crash of military music, a gallant array of cavalrymen emerged from the dust and came down the street on a gentle trot. After them came a long line of artillery, then more cavalry in splendid uniforms, and then their Imperial Majesties Napoleon III and Abdul Aziz. The vast concourse of people swung their hats and shouted. The windows and housetops of the wide vicinity burst into a snowstorm of waving handkerchiefs, and the wavers of the same mingled their cheers with those of the masses below. It was a stirring spectacle. But the two central figures claimed all my attention. Was there ever such a contrast set up before a multitude till then? Napoleon in military uniform, a long-bodied, short-legged man, fiercely mustached, old, wrinkled, with eyes half closed, and such a deep, crafty, scheming expression about them. Napoleon bowing ever so gently to the loud plaudits, and watching everything and everybody with his cat eyes from under his depressed hat brim, as if to discover any sign that those cheers were not heartfelt and cordial. Abdul Aziz, absolute lord of the Ottoman Empire, clad in dark green European clothes, almost without ornament or insignia of rank, a red Turkish fez on his head, a short, stout, dark man, black-bearded, black-eyed, stupid, unprepossessing, a man whose whole appearance somehow suggested that if only he had a cleaver in his hand and a white apron on, one would not be at all surprised to hear him say, "A mutton roast today, or will you have a nice porterhouse steak?" Napoleon III, the representative of the highest modern civilization, progress, and refinement. Abdul Aziz, the representative of a people by nature and training filthy, brutish, ignorant, unprogressive, superstitious, and a government whose three graces are tyranny, rapacity, blood. Here in brilliant Paris, under this majestic arch of triumph, the first century meets the 19th. Napoleon III, Emperor of France, surrounded by shouting thousands, by military pomp, by the splendors of his capital city, and companioned by kings and princes. This is the man who was sneered at and reviled and called bastard, yet who was dreaming of a crown and an empire all the while, who was driven into exile but carried his dreams with him, who associated with a common herd in America and ran foot races for a wager, but still sat upon a throne in fancy, who braved every danger to go to his dying mother, and grieved that she would not be spared to see him cast aside his plebeian vestments for the purple of royalty, who kept his faithful watch and walked his weary beat, a common policeman of London, but dreamed the while of coming night when he should tread the long drawn corridors of the Tuileries, who made the miserable fiasco of Strasbourg, saw his poor shabby eagle, forgetful of its lesson, refuse to perch upon his shoulder, delivered his carefully prepared, seditious burst of eloquence upon unsympathetic ears, found himself a prisoner, the butt of small wits, a mark for the pitiless ridicule of all the world, yet went on dreaming of coronations and splendid pageants as before, who lay a forgotten captive in the dungeons of Ham, and still schemed and planned and pondered over future glory and future power. President of France at last, a coup d'etat, and surrounded by applauding armies, welcomed by the thunders of cannon, he mounts a throne and waves before an astonished world the scepter of a mighty empire, who talks of the marvels of fiction, who speaks of the wonders of romance, who prates of the tame achievements of Aladdin and the Magi of Arabia. Abdul Aziz, Sultan of Turkey, Lord of the Ottoman Empire, born to a throne, weak, stupid, ignorant, almost as his meanest slave, chief of a vast royalty, yet the puppet of his premier and the obedient child of a tyrannical mother, a man who sits on a throne, the beck of whose finger moves navies and armies, who holds in his hands the power of life and death over millions, yet who sleeps, eats, idles with his 800 concubines, and when he is surfeited with eating and sleeping and idling, and would rouse up and take the reins of government and threaten to be a sultan, is charmed from his purpose by wary Fouad Pasha with a pretty plan for a new palace or a new ship, charmed away with a new toy like any other restless child, a man who sees his people robbed and oppressed by soulless tax gatherers, but speaks no word to save them, who believes in gnomes and genii and the wild fables of the Arabian Nights, but has small regard for the mighty magicians of today, and is nervous in the presence of their mysterious railroads and steamboats and telegraphs, who would see undone in Egypt all the great Mahed Ali achieved, and would prefer rather to forget than emulate him, a man who found his great empire a blot upon the earth, a degraded and poverty-stricken, miserable, infamous agglomeration of ignorance, crime, and brutality, and will idle away the allotted days of his trivial life and then pass to the dust and the worms and leave it so. Napoleon has augmented the commercial prosperity of France in 10 years to such a degree that figures can hardly compute it. He has rebuilt Paris, and has partly rebuilt every city in the state. He condemns a whole street at a time, assesses the damages, pays them, and rebuilds superbly. Then speculators buy up the ground and sell, but the original owner is given the first choice by the government at a stated price before the speculator is permitted to purchase. But above all things, he has taken the sole control of the Empire of France into his hands and made it a tolerably free land for people who will not attempt to go too far in meddling with government affairs. No country offers greater security to life and property than France, and one has all the freedom he wants, but no license to interfere with anybody or make anyone uncomfortable. As for the Sultan, one could set a trap anywhere and catch a dozen abler men in a night. The band struck up, and the brilliant adventurer Napoleon III, the genius of energy, persistence, enterprise, and the feeble Abdul Aziz, the genius of ignorance, bigotry, and indolence, prepared for the forward march. We saw the splendid review. We saw the white-mustached old Crimean soldier, Canrobert, Marshal of France. We saw everything, and then we went home satisfied.